What if the greatest act of retaliation was done without a word? What secrets may a helpless girl harbor that might destroy a whole family? And how did a legacy of destruction arise from a life based on chains? This is the little-known tale of Amara, the enslaved woman who went through unspeakable hardship before using it to bring her oppressors to ruin. Amid the year 1839, Amara was born amid Georgia's cotton fields. Freedom, even as a whisper, had never existed for her. She took her first breath under an oppressively hot sky. The ceaseless crack of whips, which sliced through the air like the language of a ruthless deity, muffled her initial cries. The plantation extended in all directions. The weight of centuries is concealed under a sea of white cotton. It was profit for the white masters. For Amara, life started in the prison. Her mother had the memories of oceans crossed in shackles within her body after being stolen from Africa when she was a young girl. She didn't say much about her motherland, frightened of the lash that followed every memory trace. However, she gifted her daughter a little blue beaded necklace. Time and perspiration had eroded it to a primitive state. However, it bore the weight of a pledge that Amara was more than the person her captors made her be. In the shadows of the slave cells, her mother murmured, "These beads are your blood. They can recall things that we can't." The woman's life was short. She was taken by fever, and Amara was left with nothing but the necklace, a relic that beat like a covert heartbeat against her chest. Her early years were rapidly hardened. Silence, obedience, and quickness were required by the overseers. Exhaustion marked the end of days that started before the sun. A strike was awarded for even the slightest hesitation. Amara's tiny hands were calloused and bloody from the brittle cotton husks by the time she was 10. She discovered that crying would not change anything. However, a sharp and patient thought was forming itself behind her quiet. She recalled every slight, every act of brutality, and every instance in which her back bowed under the burden of a world she had not chosen. She saw her masters, the Whitfields, raise tall, healthy children whose skin was unaffected by the sun or the whip. The children of the quarters were sold off like livestock, and they ran over the fields as though the ground itself bowed for their laughing. Amara watched friends go as they were driven away on wagons to far-off plantations. They never came back. Every leaving was a tiny death, shredding the fabric of the enslaved people's little family. In the depths of the night, stories were whispered around the quarters. Stories of women poisoning brutal lords, men running north, and others being captured and smashed in public squares. Amara listened, but she had no escape fantasies. For her, freedom was a perilous illusion rather than an open road. Something else, a lengthy, unforgiving patience, took root in her instead. She started to feel that it took more than hope to survive. Waiting, listening, and remembering were all necessary. Even at such a young age, she recognized patterns in cruelty. With typical hubris, the masters reenacted their acts of brutality like rituals. They thought slaves had no voice and could not remember. Amara was aware of this. In addition to the silent awareness that every blow and every humiliation was being captured in the recesses of her memory, she carried her mother's beads against her flesh. As she matured, she stopped being a child and instead became a shadow traversing the fields, taking in all the information. She observed which overseers drank excessively, which dozed off at their posts, and which areas of the property were hidden from view from the house. She clung to this information as though it would one day blossom into something greater than survival, even though she was still unsure of its purpose. And although Amara was just one person among hundreds, she looked to be carrying the weight of generations. In addition to being rich in cotton roots, the ground beneath her feet was also loaded with bones. Each rut held the recollection of the people who had bled and hunched before her. Silently, as though whispering in the heat, she felt them telling her that nothing, no pain, no cruelty, was ever really forgotten. The open brutality of the fields gave way to the more subdued suffering of the home when Amara was 16. She was selected to work inside the Whitfield home, which initially appeared to be a haven from the sun and the lash, but gradually exposed far more pernicious cruelties. Her skin was no longer scorched by the cotton rows, but there was another type of violence, one cloaked in whispers, in quiet, in the gradual suffocation of honor. The town knew the master, Thomas Whitfield, for being polite. He conducted himself with the dignity of a man who professed to represent tradition and order, and he spoke softly in public. However, inside his own house, his mask fell off. His brutality was premeditated and intentional, and it hung over Amara like a shadow that no part of the home could drive away. Margaret, his wife, wore her dissatisfaction like perfume. She was angry at her rank, angry at her husband, and angry at the little slave girl who wandered around her apartments. Although Margaret's reprimands were sharper than Thomas's, they were not as loud. A week of restless nights could result from an accidental break in a porcelain dish. Going without food could result from a dress's hem being stitched incorrectly. Her gaze followed Amara all the time, looking for faults and creating ones when none were discovered. However, Thomas was the one who caused the most severe injuries. At night, he would call Amara when the home was silent and the overseers were inebriated from fatigue. The sound of his footsteps in the hallway turned into a language of fear. She was unable to deny the statement, the creak of his door opening. Her body was no longer her own during those hours. She refrained from crying since tears gave him strength. She bore the agony in quiet, burying it deep enough that not even she could feel it. A boy with pale skin and mirrored eyes emerged from that silence. His dad's. Margaret's rage was effective and icy. Within days, the baby was removed from Amara's arms and disguised as a gift before being relocated to another plantation. There was no record of him. There was no assurance that he would return. It seemed to Amara that he had been obliterated before he had even started. No prayer could mend the deep ache in her breast that she felt from the emptiness. But something inside of her altered during that most painful moment. The sorrow didn't shatter her. It shaped her resolve into something sharper and darker. As though to remind her that memory itself was a weapon, the beaded necklace rubbed against her flesh. She started to move through the house in a different way. She evolved from a servant to an observer. She kept a careful eye on Thomas, taking note of the letters he got and tucked away, as well as the debts he attempted to hide. She witnessed the quivering of hands, the fleeting looks, and the way Margaret's gaze lingered on a visiting preacher. That revealed forbidden closeness. When they spoke angrily, when secrets leaked out like wine on a white tablecloth, she listened. The silent recording of their flaws now followed every humiliation etched into her. As a result of her limited speech, she was overlooked in their company. She could listen forgotten. She could learn by listening. And although she continued to appear to be the submissive girl who dropped her head, the stillness inside of her became perilous. The stillness has vanished out of terror. It was the quiet of anticipation. Years blended together, each characterized by the same brutality and submissive rituals, until time itself began to feel like yet another tool of enslavement. However, Amara was evolving behind the surface of regularity. The agony that had threatened to overwhelm her had become a cool, calculating creature. She had acquired the perilous art of waiting, and her silence was no longer that of a victim. She gained insight into the inner workings of the Whitfield home with a level of closeness that none of its members could imagine. Despite his gentlemanly demeanor, Thomas Whitfield was drowning in debt. He made false promises he couldn't follow through on, mortgaged land he no longer owned, and concealed letters about desperate deals in the bottom drawer of his study. Bound by appearances but tormented by longing, Margaret found solace in the embraces of a preacher who came to their house pretending to be offering spiritual advice. The Whitfields were an example of order to the outer world. Amara saw them as a decaying from the inside out. She discovered a figure hiding in the shadows one evening as she was hauling firewood to the barn. A thin, hollow-eyed guy advanced with the hesitancy of one who has been pursued for too long. He was a fugitive named Josiah who had spent months avoiding capture. Amara was shocked to learn that he was not the only one who survived. The Whitfield's youngest daughter, Clara, had been feeding him in secret. Clara, who was just 13 years old, acted out of innocent benevolence because she thought she was defending a needy soul. She was not yet aware of the risk that such leniency entailed. Amara examined Josiah's face, noting the worry in his eyes and the tiredness in his bones. For an instant, she thought about helping him north, joining the innumerable murmurs of runaways who followed the river of stars to freedom. However, the thought vanished as fast as it appeared. She didn't want to get away. In addition to these walls, the recollection of everything that had been taken from her served as her jail. She refused to run. She would remain and make use of it. Her decision to keep Josiah's existence a secret was motivated by calculation rather than sympathy. He was a weapon, and weapons could be used with just the proper hand. In a way that made the mistress blanch with scandal, she hinted to Margaret that others had spotted a shadow close to the barn. She whispered to Thomas about stories circulating in the village, men talking about covert escapes, rewards for capturing them, and rumors that could damage his already tarnished reputation. Every phrase was a carefully sown seed that was allowed to flourish in the rich soil of their paranoia. Even while Josiah trusted Clara, he started to rely on Amara. She kept him hidden from the overseers, provided him leftovers, and led him when voices approached. He failed to see the way her gaze lingered, not with compassion, but with calculating intentness, as though each decision he made was just one more element she could use to forward her plan. The exterior of the Whitfield house remained unaltered, while the interior cracks became wider. Amara's cautious whispers heightened Margaret's concerns, and she started to keep a closer eye on her husband. Thomas became agitated and haunted by obligations and unnamed shadows. Unaware that her secret generosity had already been turned into a weapon of silent destruction, Clara held on to it, and Amara felt the weight of her mother's promise in every heartbeat as she carried her beads under her clothing. In her stillness, the girl who had before bowed under the lash now stood more erect. She no longer persevered only to survive. She persevered because she was anticipating the time when quiet would be insufficient. The Whitfield. With its walls announcing riches and permanence, the estate has long served as a symbol of order. However, behind the surface, strain developed like rot in an old house's beams. Amara went around the rooms in silence, and nobody paid any attention to the servant. But she was the lifeblood that held all the secrets. Her quiet had become more piercing, like a blade steadily slicing into the fabric of the home. She started with Margaret. She had always been hated by the mistress. But suddenly, like poisoned droplets, Amara's murmurs crept into Margaret's ear. She mentioned Thomas's obligations, of the potential for him to sell some items in the house to cover his debt. Although she never mentioned her own name out loud, she let Margaret consider the idea that Amara would be sold and discarded like a piece of property. The idea of her spouse making decisions behind her back was unacceptable to a woman who had based her entire existence on control. Margaret's remarks became icier and her gaze sharper, but Amara could tell that panic had already set in. She had a different thread with Thomas. She whispered in passing tremblingly that Margaret stayed alone for long afternoons and that the pastor stayed longer. When the neighbors noticed the carriage outside the Whitfield gate, they muttered more than was necessary. Though the seeds of doubt lay readily in Thomas's pride, her tone was that of someone who dreaded retaliation and did not want to betray her mistress. He started observing Margaret, his remarks becoming harsh and his temper ebbing. Josiah, meanwhile, was still in the barn, hidden but agitated. He trusted Clara-Ara's innocence, but he owed his survival to Amara's leadership. The tiny child thought her generosity was an act of pure mercy. But that illusion was dashed one late evening when Margaret made her discovery. Her breath seized in her throat, her urge to scream rising like fire as she saw Josiah's shadow, the distinct silhouette of a runaway slave huddled among the tools. However, Amara arrived before the scream could be heard. Margaret was quieted by the quiet intensity with which Amara spoke in that tense moment. She brought to memory the preacher, hushed looks, and the delicate glass that preserved her reputation. Margaret ran the risk of endangering Josiah if she disclosed the escapee, talking in turn, and if he did, things may fall apart. Margaret's face was bloodless and her lips were sealed. For the first time, the mistress gave her servant a fearful look rather than one of contempt. The household was burdened with a secret that no one dared to discuss after that night. Margaret paced uneasily. Thomas pondered suspiciously. Josiah remained both necessary and hidden, while Clara held on to her delusion of kindness. Amara was the only one who moved deliberately, her quiet directing each the tapestry's dissolving thread. In subtle but indisputable ways, the Whitfields started to fall apart. Margaret became openly hostile and yelled at her husband. The atmosphere at their dinner became tense with resentment as Thomas retaliated with accusations. Torn between her fear of being found out and her desire to keep Josiah safe, Clara cried at night. Amara stood at the midst of it all, invisible yet vital, the guardian of the secrets that could destroy them all. It was no longer a survival game. It was power, slow and methodical, constructed from the very shadows she had previously been forced to live in by the Whitfields. The fissures got wider every day. The home itself seemed to hold its breath as the silence grew deeper each night. The summer of 1859 came with a lot of heat and fear. Like an invisible hand, disease spread over the area, afflicting neighbor after neighbor with fevers that internally burnt the body. At first, Thomas Whitfield's illness appeared to be the result of pure luck. However, as the days went by and his power diminished, rumors of divine retribution began to circulate across the nation. His once dominant body deteriorated into weakness, and his once powerful voice turned into a quivering whisper. Amara was standing on the edge of his collapse. He is now the quiet guardian of his destiny rather than the servant who obeys orders. She was the only one who measured his food, watched after his water, and managed who was allowed in the room. Frantically, Margaret pleaded for admission. However, Amara dictated the phrases, her stare unwavering, her voice quiet. The house mistress was helpless, confined within her own house and barred, not by force but by dread. In his fever, Thomas raged and yelled accusations, his madness revealing long-hidden secrets. There were debts and devastation that no prayer could wash away, and he hurled curses of betrayal and screamed out Margaret's name in rage. Margaret's dignity, which had once been her armor, crumbled around her, shattering her poise. She charged Amara with witchcraft, working with the shadows and destroying the Whitfield name. However, her words fell apart like a riot when she attempted to share these anxieties with her neighbors. She talked about stolen letters, a preacher's prohibited touch, and a fugitive in the barn. Quick to protect appearances, the community wrote her off as unstable. She was soon removed and placed in a squalid asylum where her cries went unheard. The youngest, Clara, stood in confusion in the aftermath. Her once simple benevolence had become entangled in webs she was unable to understand. Her mother died, her father passed away, and the estate she was transferred north to distant relatives after collapsing under debt. She would never fully name the shadows that engulfed her upbringing. Amara moved purposefully in the ensuing silence. The home that had served as her jail was now empty, its owners having been overthrown, not by a chain uprising, but by the silent discovery of their own secrets. She had papers from Thomas's study with her, evidence of debts and betrayals that may buy fresh starts. Josiah, no longer a fugitive concealed in the shadows, walked beside her, but a friend along the uncharted road ahead. The sound of footfall on the damp ground was muffled by the heavy rain that occurred the night before they left. Abolitionists provided them with sanctuary, and they vanished beyond the cotton fields into a horizon where legend would one day say they arrived in Philadelphia. Others said that they made their covert return, passing across the same territory that had oppressed them like shadows, invisible but never far from sight. One thing was for sure, the Whitfields, who had once been so proud, had been eaten from inside. Their fall was written by the silent retaliation of the lady they thought had no voice, not by conflict or the law. Amara had endured shame and carried her suffering in quiet. But in the end, she left behind devastation rather than silence.